this Prime Minister open his eyes, stop doubling down on failed policies, and just change course.
And the decision we continue to make is to invest in Canadians who need support, invest in our communities, invest in a brighter future for all. And the next step of that is the very first thing we're doing today is announcing that we will be lowering taxes, as promised, for tens of millions of Canadians.
The Liberals moved ahead today on one of their key campaign promises to cut taxes for the, quote, middle class. If their motion passes, Canadians will pay no federal taxes on the first $15,000 they earn by 2023. That's up nearly $3,000 from the current ceiling of $12,000. The Liberals say the top 1% will not benefit. So how much will the measure impact your bottom line? Earlier, I spoke with Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau. Hi, Minister Morneau. Nice to see you.
It's great to be here.
Let me turn to the tax cut that you announced today. You said, and the calculations from the government are that it will save the average individual at its full implementation about $300 a year. How significant in someone's life economically do you think that is?
Well, I think this is significant on multiple levels. I mean, first of all, it's significant because it's hitting a very large number of Canadians. So 20 million Canadians are going to see a reduction in their taxes. That we know is going to help, as we can see, a large number of people to face up to their economic anxiety. It has a pretty important impact on people who are struggling to get by. We heard a lot from people that are challenged. So this, in particular, raises people all the way up from the lowest level of the income scale right up to $150,000 or so. But finally, it puts a lot of money into the economy. So in the first year, it will be about $3 billion that's going back to Canadians, back in their pockets. And as fully done, it'll be $6 billion. So it's a very material tax reduction, and we think it's important. We promised we'd do this. It's going to give people, more money and, of course, more confidence.
What's the metric by which you'll judge its effectiveness? I ask because when you proposed in 2015 the Canada Child Benefit, there were specific markers. It's going to reduce child poverty by X. I think it ended up reducing. It's known to be a pretty effective measure in that it reduced child poverty from 11% to 9% since it was introduced. What metric will you use to judge the effectiveness of this measure?
I think with a tax reduction, the metric is pretty straightforward. I mean, is the tax reduction going to the people that you expect it to? By definition, this will. This is going to go to a large cross-section of Canadians. I think what we'll also be trying to do is to ensure that we continue to think about other things we can do to deal with that economic anxiety. So that will be recognizing that we address issues that we talked about in the campaign, how parents are doing when they're off with their children. We'll be thinking about how we can help students. We'll be looking at moving forward on measures that are going to actually help seniors. So there'll be multiple things that we'll do that will address that affordability challenge that people are facing. But first and foremost, we wanted to start with reducing taxes.
I guess I'm asking, though, because your critics, the opposition, will say this is a $6 billion hole that you're punching in federal revenues. And what kind of impact at the end of the day is it going to have? Was this just a vote getter during the election, or do you think this will have a material impact on the economy?
Well, it will, by definition, have an impact on the economy, because when you give more money to Canadians, they're likely to spend it. That's money that's going to go back into the economy. But I think in the first instance, what we're responding to is the challenge that people are facing in their lives with the economic challenges that they're seeing. We heard loud and clear during the course of the election campaign that people are worried about how they can get ahead. They're looking at things like their household debt and having to pay not only the interest but the debt. So this will put people in a better position, and it's entirely consistent with what we've been doing for the last 4 years, which has worked. It's been putting more money into people's pockets, which has allowed them to put it back into the economy. We've seen growth. We're still projecting that our growth this year and next year will be, in the first two in the G7. And it will continue, we hope, to help us with our strong employment, which has been positive.
Actually, though, there are some sort of troubling warning signs where exactly what you just pointed out is concerned, particularly jobs. On Friday, we got the numbers out for November. 71,000 jobs lost in that month, the biggest single loss since the Great Recession years ago. We've also seen the number of bankruptcies increase a lot as well. Are you putting the federal coffers in the best possible position? Are you insulating the government from what could be the onset of troubling economic times or even a recession?
I think we have to be balanced as we look at these things. You did mention those two things that we saw last week, and that's real, so we have to pay attention to them. The week before, we saw very, very good investment numbers. Just in the last few days, we've seen very good employment numbers in the United States. So there are different numbers that come out that we watch carefully. But overall, what are we seeing? We're seeing that the economic forecasters are predicting continued growth this year and next year. We're seeing that we're at or near some of the lowest levels of unemployment we've seen in a very, very long time. And we're responding by continuing to invest, but invest at the right level. So not investing at a pace that we don't think is sustainable, like it's happening in the United States, but at a pace that makes sense and allows us the resiliency to deal with economic challenges that we might face.
But you're increasing the deficit by a lot. It's more than you had predicted when you were in government, right? What you've promised a lot of spending in the campaign. This is a $6 billion hole in the federal coffers. If that recession is down the road at some point, and I take your point on all the indicators right now, but those job numbers are troubling to a lot of people. If that recession is down the road, is this the best thing to do right now?
We think the best thing to do is to do exactly this. It's to invest in the future. It's to put more money in people's pockets. They can put it back into the economy. It is the approach that worked as we tried to get out of the 7.1% unemployment that we were left at the end of the Harper years and got ourselves to a much better position. So continuing to make those investments, doing it in a way that doesn't put us in a vulnerable position, because we're still going to be able to reduce our debt as a function of our economy over time. So that leaves us in a position where we can continue to invest. As I said, we're expecting growth. That is the prognosis, but we always want to be prepared for any eventuality, and we do think that we have a strong balance sheet to deal with any challenges.
So you're not worried about a recession?
You know, my job, Vashi, is to worry. I have to worry about numbers that come out last week. I also have to look at that in contrast to numbers that came out the following week or the week before. So we will always look to make sure that we have the ability to respond to challenges. But no, we have to look at what is the projection that we're dealing with. We're dealing with an economy that's strong. We'd, of course, always like it to be stronger. We're projecting growth. We continue to have very low unemployment numbers. We have high levels of workforce participation. So it is an economy that is largely doing well. We're going to continue to invest, though, because we don't want to be in a position where we don't continue to ensure that we have these strong employment numbers and continue to have good wage growth, which we're beginning to see. We also need to recognize there are challenges in the parts of the country.
Thanks, Minister.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
And just to be clear, the tax reduction that we're talking about today will help 20 million Canadians. And that includes Canadians in Alberta and Saskatchewan and other places where people are experiencing challenges.
The state of Canada's economy was under scrutiny today on Parliament Hill, as you saw there. The Liberals moved on their first order of business, a middle-class tax cut. According to the Conservatives, though, it's too little, too late. They say bigger and faster tax cuts are needed to kickstart an economy that's on the brink of recession. So how at risk is Canada's economy, and how much could this tax cut help Canadians? Rebecca Young is the Director of Fiscal and Provincial Economics with Scotiabank. She joins us from Toronto. And next to me here in studio, David McDonald is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Hello to both of you. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Rebecca, I'll start with you. Let's start, before we get to sort of the bigger picture where the economy is concerned, I wanted to get a bit of a reality check on what the Liberals introduced today. What do you think the intent of the measure that they've announced is, and do you think it will fulfill that intent?
Let me just start by saying that I think the intent really was to target the issue of household affordability. This was clearly a campaign issue, and across all platforms we heard that this was a concern raised by Canadians. So I think this was a promised commitment. Everyone was expecting it, and what was laid out during the platform is essentially what was delivered. And so it is, by and large, a very broad-based tax cut affecting 20 million Canadians, as the minister laid out, or in fact about 97% of tax filers fall into that category that will be affected by today's cuts.
And what does it mean, David, for people who are watching right now? I'm going to be affected by it. In what way?
Well, it's a particular family type that really benefits from this. So if you're a two-earner family and you make in the 9th out of 10 deciles, so you're way at the top end of the income spectrum, you make between $140,000 and $200,000. Well, that group is far more likely to make the maximum $600 per family. For most Canadians, actually, it's going to be much less than that. On average, on a family base, it's going to be about $300. What that means for most Canadians individually is a reduction in their taxes of $13 a month. and that's going to be a change at source. So again, it is extremely broad and very thin in terms of how much individual Canadians benefit, but it's incredibly expensive. So $3 billion in the first year, ramping up to $6 billion when it's fully implemented. I know you watching federal politics, 100 or 200 million isn't real money. $6 billion is real money. A year, I mean, that's the foundation for a national affordable child plan, for instance. That's the doubling or tripling of the number of new units that would be constructed under a national housing policy. And so this is money that won't be spent on those priorities, but will be spent on a broad tax cut that I would argue a lot of Canadians probably aren't going to see, most of the benefit going to higher income families.
What's your understanding, Rebecca, of who ends up benefiting? And just on the last point that David made, the government insisted today that the top 1%, for example, will not benefit from this.
Yes, I would agree. The top tax earners are not eligible for this benefit, and it is very broad-based. The majority of Canadian households will benefit, but it will be a small amount, whether it's $300 or $600 a year, and as was pointed out, that can amount to $13 a month, upward of, even half that for bi-weekly payroll employees. So it is modest, and I would point out that it's transitory, and so you'll see that increase as it's phased in as a one-off, but the next year we won't see that boost as it translates to spending in the economy. So it'll be, overall, it's not a game changer either in the magnitude of what it'll mean for the household, but also for the economy and the impact, especially in the outer years.
Yeah, that's actually what I want to drill down on, because that was my question to Minister Morneau. When they introduced the Canada Child Benefit, I understand it's a very different thing, but it was their marquee promise in 2015. They had, a metric by which we could judge whether or not it was having an impact writ large on the economy. When I asked the minister today, he said, by definition, it will have an impact because if Canadians get more money or save money in taxes, then they're likely to spend that money. Is that true?
I mean, different Canadians have a different propensity to spend, and that's what's interesting. This is actually the reverse of the type of distribution that you'd want to see if your goal was, certainly if your goal was poverty reduction, but even if your goal was increase in economic growth, you want more income transferred to lower income households who are going to spend that money immediately. The way it's structured as is, it's higher income households that are going to get most of that benefit. They're more likely to save the money, spend it on debt, or spend it on imports, which doesn't benefit GDP directly.
Does it help them with affordability, though?
Higher income households making between $140,000 and $200,000, sure, it gives them an extra $600. They're the ones that are going to get much closer to that maximum benefit. I mean, if you're in the middle of the income spectrum, I'd actually argue that $13 a month isn't really all that valuable to you. But if you have a young child, a national child care plan would be valuable to you. If you're trying to find a place to rent, lower rental costs would be much more valuable to you. And that's the trade-off, is $6 billion is real money. We could be spending it in a different way. Big down payment on climate change, for instance, is another way that we could probably drive more economic growth and might be more useful in a longer-term productivity perspective.
Rebecca, let me broaden it out a bit, and let's talk about the economy as a whole right now. We saw some numbers where the employment numbers, rather, from Statistics Canada out on Friday. November saw the biggest drop in jobs, a loss of 21,000 jobs since 2009. How big of a warning sign is that from your perspective?
Well, first of all, we don't see a recession coming. I think that we do see a slowing of growth. We see a structural and a cyclical slowdown. We've benefited, though, from tremendous job growth and wage growth over the last couple of years, and particularly the first half of the year. So it is definitely a surprise, this last month of data. But on the other hand, we've also seen a positive uptick on business investment. But over the cloud over all of this is really that trade uncertainty and what's going to happen south of the border. That's really the biggest drag, arguably, on the Canadian economy as it flows through to our trade and export channels. So I think that we, to put this into perspective, we really need to see how the economy is going to play out and how the politics are going to play out the second half of the year, that we don't see a recession. And if we do see a recession, quite honestly, the amounts we're talking about today aren't going to be what makes the difference. We're really going to need far bigger levers, both in terms of monetary policy and much greater fiscal policy. And what we're seeing today is really just a drop in the bucket if that were the case. But that's not what we see as the case. I think that we do see a structural slowdown, but not at an alarming rate. And we certainly need to see more data to be convinced that we are heading in a difficult direction.
David, your perspective on the economy right now?
Well, certainly, I mean, the last time we saw really low unemployment rates was just before a massive recession in 2008, the biggest one we saw since the Great Depression. So I'm not sure the changes in short-term unemployment rate figures are giving us any indication of what's going to happen 3-6 months down the road. Certainly, the real challenges for the next recession, whether it comes 6 months from now or a year from now, we will have another recession in Canada. I think that we'll all agree on that. We just have a lot less play when it comes to monetary policy. So decreasing interest rates, the Bank of Canada's decrease in interest rates just has a lot less power than it used to. And governments at the same time often seem far less willing than they have been in the past to engage in major stimulus programs to offset that lack of power from the central bank. And so that's the real challenges. And what I mean by stimulus here is deficits.
Do you mean even I mean, they're running deficits now. They ran big ones in 2009.
Yeah, and the question is, would they be willing to double that deficit in the case of a recession? That's the sort of thing that we would need to not have a prolonged recession. And I'm unsure as to whether there's an interest in doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and let me just quickly follow up before we go, because the argument from the other side is you need to manage the deficit right now in order to insulate yourself against what could be coming so that you have the room should you need it.
Well, I mean, the debt-to-GDP ratio has been fairly low. It's been fairly constant. You could run twice the deficit and still not really see a big change in the debt-to-GDP ratio. I mean, that's sort of it's because billions are different than millions, and therefore governments should never run deficits. I mean, the interesting thing to point out is that a government deficit by definition means more money in the pockets of households because you're charging lower taxes or you're providing higher services. And so we think of deficits sometimes the opposite of the way we should.
Rebecca, your last word to you on that?
Well, I think that we need to really think about fiscal policy in two different times. And so when we talk about a recessionary time, we really want spending that is targeted and timely and transitory. And what we see today is not that. We do see a structural change of lowering our taxes. So it does reduce the firepower later on in a downturn for government revenues. But in the big scheme of things, it is very small. I think whether we're looking at federal deficits running below 1% of GDP at a time when many provinces are consolidating. And so, in fact, the stimulatory effect of federal government measures is not necessarily that strong. But the longer-term challenge for Canadians really is about how do we boost longer-term growth, and we're just not having that conversation right now, and we need to focus on future policies and future spending on unlocking that growth.
Well, I'll have to have you both back to have that conversation a bit later. Thanks very much to both of you for your insights this evening. Thanks to Rebecca Young of Scotiabank and David McDonald of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The Liberals are moving forward with their campaign pledge to lower taxes. In January, they'll begin boosting the amount you can earn before you have to pay tax, eventually phasing out the benefit for the richest Canadians. How significant is the cut for the average taxpayer, and what will it mean for the federal government's budget? Will any party vote against such a measure? Time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, Jason Markisoff of Maclean's. Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs is in our CBC studios over in Toronto this evening. In Montreal, Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal cabinet minister, and next to me, former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, Rachel Curran, now with Harper and Associates, and the CBC Zone, John Paul Tasker. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Beth.
Nice to see this supersized Monday Power Panel. JP, why don't I start with you? Talk a bit about the politics behind this. This was a key campaign pledge for the Liberals. Is it a smart move for them to be introducing it right away?
You might remember the timing when they announced this. It was right after blackface, and it was only a couple days after Andrew Scheer had revealed his own tax cut plan. So I think they felt they had to present something similar to the voters, and they're delivering. I mean, this builds on what they proposed in the last Parliament when they cut the middle income bracket. This is dealing now with the lowest bracket, if you will, by kind of eliminating taxes altogether. There is a risk, though, that this is just too modest of a tax cut, that people won't actually notice it, because it's phased in over 4 years, and really the maximum benefit is $300 for a single person or $11 a month. So there's a risk that they don't get any political payoff from actually introducing something that really does have a hit to the federal budget. I mean, it's sizable in terms of the cost of the Treasury, but in terms of what people will actually gain from this, it's pretty small. It's kind of small potatoes. I mean, I think Bill Morneau has other pressing issues to deal with after that jobs report last week. I think that they're hoping this might be, they can sell it as some sort of fiscal stimulus. I just don't see how it really makes any meaningful impact on the economy when we're waiting until 2023 for this to be fully phased in. I think it's pretty limited.
Bill Morneau's argument there, Rachel, is that if you get, if Canadians have more money in their pocket thanks to a tax cut, they will effectively spend that money in the economy. Yes. Politically, was this a smart move to introduce it so quickly? Given, JP points out the Conservatives had introduced something very similar. This was, from my knowledge, the Liberals had been planning this as a sort of key campaign pledge for a long time. Yeah. Affordability was a big issue in the campaign. Is this a smart move?
I think it is. It was one of the key promises they made during the campaign. They did say the first thing they would do is introduce a tax cut for the middle class. That's also how they started off their first mandate, of course, in 2015. And I think they need to deliver quickly on some of those key promises. So I do think it's smart for them to do this. I'm not as sympathetic to the argument that this is only a small amount. Any of these broad-based tax cuts are going to be incredibly expensive, and they don't have necessarily a significant impact on individual budgets. But I can't criticize the Liberals for cutting taxes.
I've asked you to do the impossible.
Yeah, no, I actually think this is good policy. If I was going to quibble with anything, I don't love the idea in principle of taking more people off the tax rolls. More than a million Canadians, a million more Canadians are going to come off the tax rolls entirely. Just as a matter of principle, I do think everyone should have a little bit of a stake in the tax system. So if I was going to quibble with something,
although their argument is that helps the lowest.
It does help the lowest income people. I just think we should all have a stake in how tax dollars are spent, and that generally leads to better policy overall. But that's a relatively minor quibble. I think the bigger issue, and you heard this from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, is we have no plan to get anywhere near a balanced budget. And so we're getting a tax cut now, yes, but is that simply deferring pain down the road when we've got to account for all of this spending that we're doing?
Brad, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree with Rachel. I'm not ideologically in favor of cutting taxes. If you were to ask the average, and I know the Liberals ran on this, and while we were all paying attention, obviously, to the last election campaign, it's one of these things that Liberals do very well is they put a whole bunch of other things in the window and they mention this, and then all of a sudden this becomes their first priority. If you were to ask, if you had $6 billion by the time this is all completely phased in, would this be your first next thing? I don't believe that you can hope that people will spend their $12, $13 a month, or depending if they're two-income families. I can't really see a lot of stimulus within the economy that Mr. Morneau was talking about at the top of the show. I can't stimulate a lot of the economy on $26 a month or $30 a month, depending on how much back I'm going to be getting. At the same time, you hope that they spend it, but there's no direct connection to spending. A lot of folks might be paying down $26 a month in debt off, and we're not going to be seeing that on Main Street per se. So lots of other things that could actually, I think, help those folks in the low income brackets or even the middle income brackets that might help affordability. Certainly that was the theme of the election campaign, but $13 a month is not going to make that bridge that a lot of people, I think, would say that $6 billion should go for.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. I think what the minister's response to that was today, Yolande, was that, they seem to be really honing in on the affordability idea, and that this will make a difference. $300 a year, up to $600 for a family. Eventually, I should say, when it's all fully implemented in 4 years. What do you think of that argument? Do you think it will resonate?
Well, I think it will resonate. For one, allow me to disagree respectfully, of course, with Brad in that.
Please.
With Brad in that, I remember quite clearly during the campaign that this was something that the Liberal Party did put at the forefront of their commitment. And had they not been moving forward with this as one of their top commitments, they would have been criticized for it, because the issue of affordability and the cost of living was such an important issue to a lot of Canadians during the campaign. Whether they're making the right choice at the right time. I think back to whether it's provincially or federally, whenever any government announces tax cuts, there's always criticism. Well, it's not enough. It's not going to make a big difference. But I think that when you look at the number of $12,000 of income moving to $15,000, I get that it's not exempted from taxes, that it's progressive. I think that does make make a difference in the lives of people who are trying to squeeze and make ends meet. Coupled with the fact that it's not just in isolation. I think the minister in an interview with you a few minutes ago was very clear on the fact that this is something that's in line with what they've done since 2015 with announcing the initial tax cut now, as well as the child benefit. So when you take when you add all of those actions together, I think it does make a significant difference in Canadians' lives, and I think they were right to go forward with it quickly as we head into the holiday season. You know, the burden is always on the government in a minority situation to show that they can make Parliament work, but people are going to be asking questions as to say, okay, so all right, the government was elected in October 21st. Has anything happened? And already with this, they're able to say, we've already moved forward on this political promise.
And Jason, given that, what kind of support do you expect from the parties, or lack thereof?
Well, it was interesting to hear the either side. The Conservatives said that this should be faster. That's what Pierre Poilievre said. He said this should be faster. They should do it all in one fell swoop. The NDP said they should have cut off the effect of this at a much lower income bracket level. I mean, it is interesting, unlike a lot of tax cuts where they just simply cut one of the rate levels, the federal government, the Liberals, decided to actually cap off this, where people who earn over $150,000 won't get as much of the benefit from it, and people who earn more than $200,000 get roughly none of this. And that's something that hasn't been done for a tax move like this since the 90s, Paul Martin's budgets. So that's one interesting thing. And I think when the Liberals see one side saying you're not, Conservatives saying you're not cutting fast enough, and the other side saying you're cutting too much for the higher end. That's a nice place where Liberals want to be in the middle. It's, the middle class isn't going to feel this much as the lower class, but it just doesn't work for the federal Liberals branding to call this a lower class tax cut. They don't have a minister of lower class prosperity, but I would say the biggest benefit will be at those lower income levels, the ones who won't be will be getting tax rebates at the end of this now.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.